Imagine winning $5 million today, only to pay for it later with the most precious thing you own, the jewel of your life. In 1960, this man won the largest lottery prize in Australian history, but he didn't know that the ticket which made him the richest man in the country was the same one that would write the end of the life he knew. Here is the terrifying story that made the world stop dreaming of quick wealth. Our story begins in Sydney in 1960. The city was planning to build its legendary landmark, the Sydney Opera House. The cost was astronomical, so to fund it, the authorities decided to organize the largest lottery in Australian history. People went crazy. Millions of tickets were sold as everyone chased that lucky break that would change their lives forever. Among the millions of participants was a man named Basil Thorne, a simple 37-year-old man working as a traveling salesman, moving from town to town for a very modest income. He lived with his wife, Frida, and his child, Graham, in a small apartment. Unlike others, Basil didn't buy dozens or hundreds of tickets. He bought just one. And then the miracle happened. That single ticket was the jackpot winner, 100,000 Australian pounds, worth nearly $5 million today. In an instant, without any warning, the traveling salesman became a millionaire.
But here is where the trouble began. In that era, there was no such thing as privacy. The law required the winner's photo, name, and even their detailed home address to be published in every newspaper. Suddenly, Basil's modest home turned into a shrine. Journalists knocked on the door day and night, neighbors asked for handouts, and relatives he hadn't seen in years suddenly appeared, driven by family ties, or rather, self-interest. Even charities swarmed his life. The family's life was turned upside down, but Basil and his wife Frida didn't care much. The joy of the millions outweighed all the harassment. They were planning for a new house, a new car, and a bright future for their child, Graham. But what Basil didn't realize was that there were other eyes reading his home address in the newspaper. Eyes that didn't want a donation, but wanted something far more precious.
Basil and his wife, Frida, were not the reckless type. They knew the stories of winners who ended up broke, so they decided to handle their millions with extreme caution. Basil even refused to quit his grueling job as a traveling salesman temporarily, just to ensure the family's stability. Everything was being handled wisely, but as the saying goes, winds blow as the ships do not desire. Their 8-year-old son, Graham, attended a private school a short distance away. Since his father was always traveling and his mother didn't drive, a family friend, Mrs. Phyllis Smith, would drop him off along with her own children. 8:30 in the morning. The usual routine began. Graham stepped out of the house in his neat school uniform, heading toward the corner of O'Brien Street, where a small supermarket stood. It was a very short distance, just a few steps to meet the family friend on her way to the school. In those few minutes, one of his classmates spotted him walking calmly toward the corner. That was the last time Graham would ever be seen moving of his own free will.
Mrs. Phyllis arrived in her car exactly on time, but the spot was empty. She sent her son to look for him inside the supermarket or around the nearby corners, but there was no sign of Graham. Feeling a surge of anxiety, Phyllis drove immediately to the Thorne home. She knocked loudly on the door, and Frida, the mother, came out only to be met by the question that made the blood run cold in her veins. Where is Graham? I didn't find him at our usual spot, the mother replied in a panic. He left minutes ago. Mrs. Phyllis tried to reassure her and headed to the school, thinking perhaps someone else had given him a ride, but she returned with the grim confirmation. Graham never arrived at school today. In that moment, calm that Basil and Frida had carefully planned collapsed. Graham had vanished within the tiny distance between his front door and the street corner. Without hesitation, the mother rushed to the phone, her hand trembling, and dialed the police. She had no idea she was opening the door to a nightmare that would dominate headlines across the globe.
The police arrived,
and the detective began reassuring Freda. But suddenly, the ringing of the phone cut through every promise. The mother picked up the receiver with a numb expression, only to hear a strange voice asking, "Are you Freda Thorne, Graham's mother?" The moment she answered yes, her heart sank. "I have your son." The detective, who was monitoring the situation, quickly grabbed the receiver. The kidnapper, thinking he was speaking to the father, Basil, said coldly, "You will never see him again except through a ransom." When the detective asked for the amount, the figure was shocking: £25,000 by 5 o'clock this evening. The detective was stunned. At that moment, he didn't even know this family had won the lottery. £25,000 in 1960 was a fortune, equivalent to over $1 million today. When the detective tried to maneuver, saying, "Where would we get such an amount?" the angry reply came, revealing everything. "Don't play games with me. Get the money ready, or I'll feed your son to the sharks." In that moment, the bitter truth dawned on everyone. The kidnapper hadn't chosen Graham at random. He had read the newspapers, he knew exactly how much the prize was, and he had come to take his share of the family's flesh. The kidnapper hung up, leaving the detective puzzled by two things. The accent. The kidnapper wasn't Australian. He had a heavy Eastern European accent. And the strange threat. The phrase, "I'll feed him to the sharks," was a brutal and unusual threat, suggesting someone who was either mentally unstable or deeply criminal. The entire Bondi police force was mobilized, and the chief inspector arrived in person. At that time, Australia was a very safe country, and kidnapping children for money was an alien, bizarre crime to their society. The plan was to work in total secrecy to save Graham. But could a story of this magnitude truly remain a secret?
While the police were trying to work in silence, an insider had betrayed them and leaked the information. Suddenly, radio and television vans lined up in front of the Thorne family home. The Daily Mirror didn't just publish the news, they printed posters across the streets of Sydney in bold headlines that read, "I'll feed him to the sharks." This crime became a national shock. Australia had never in its modern history witnessed the case of a child kidnapped for ransom. Even the most hardened criminals and gangs followed an unwritten moral code. Children are a red line. But this kidnapper had broken all the rules. The police were trembling with fear regarding the kidnapper's reaction. When a criminal feels the spotlight is on him, he tends to flee or dispose of the evidence. At 5 o'clock in the evening, the deadline set by the kidnapper, the detective sat by the phone with the money ready in 3 bags as requested. 5 o'clock passed, then 6, then night fell, and the phone never rang. A terrifying silence took hold. Had the kidnapper backed off because of the media frenzy, or had the catastrophe already occurred? In the meantime, Basil Thorne's plane touched down at Sydney Airport. He wasn't met with the reception of a millionaire lottery winner. Instead, he found an army of journalists chasing him with microphones and questions. He fought his way through them with a shattered heart, caring nothing for money or fame. He wanted only one thing: his son, Graham. Basil returned home to find his wife, Freda, in a state of total collapse, and a team of detectives trying to devise a backup plan. The biggest problem now was, how do we reach a kidnapper who has suddenly decided to vanish? There was no longer any room for silence. In a desperate move, detectives took Basil Thorne to the Bondi police station. The grief-stricken father stood before dozens of cameras and microphones, and with a trembling voice and tears he could not hold back, he issued a direct plea to the kidnapper. "Please, just give me back my son."
Well, all I can say is that the person that's got him, if he's a father and got children of his own, well, for God's sake, send him back. I can't.
All right, gentlemen.
What a heart-wrenching scene it was. The man who just days ago was the talk of the town for his legendary luck was now the talk of the town for his unbearable tragedy. The case was no longer just about the Thorne family.
It became the cause of all Australia. Public outrage was so overwhelming that the government discussed changing the laws to make kidnapping a capital offense, punishable by death or life imprisonment. But what was truly strange was the underworld joining the search. Sydney's organized crime syndicates, who feared no law, unleashed their men onto the streets to find the kidnapper. The police harbored a genuine fear. If the gangs found the kidnapper before they did, he would never make it to court alive. They would subject him to the law of the jungle. Sydney turned into a beehive of activity. The government offered £5,000, and the Daily Mirror raised the stakes with another $15,000. We are talking about a reward worth nearly $1 million in today's value. Thousands of calls poured into the police station, and hundreds of officers sorted through reports day and night, searching for a single thread amidst this mountain of information.
From among thousands of reports, a terrifying picture began to emerge. Witnesses among the family's neighbors in the Bondi area confirmed seeing a strange man sitting in the park overlooking the Thorn House for several days. He would hide behind a newspaper, but his features were clear. A middle-aged man with sharp features, a broad face, and black hair that had started to go bald. And, most importantly, very thick eyebrows and a formal suit. When the mother, Freda, heard this description, her face turned pale as she remembered. This man knocked on my door 3 weeks ago. At the time, he claimed he was looking for someone named Mr. Bogner, a fictitious name that didn't exist in the entire area. He had been watching them. He had been studying his victim with meticulous care. The final thread came from a witness who saw a blue 1955 Ford Custom Line parked strangely at the intersection on the morning of the kidnapping. The driver inside was no ordinary person. He possessed those same unforgettable features, the same broad face and thick eyebrows.
Why would someone park there? Why not park down another 20 metres and make it easy for people or cars to get around? And that's more or less stood out in my mind at that particular stage.
Now, the police had an enemy with a clear face, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. But the terrifying question remained: where is Graham now?
Initially, the detectives were surprised by the witness's precision in describing the car. For someone to identify it as a Ford Custom Line, its color as blue, and its model specifically as 1955 was enough to raise suspicions. But the witness told them simply, "I am a car expert." To leave no room for doubt, they put him through rigorous testing. They brought him car catalogs and took him on a driving tour through the streets of Sydney, asking him to identify the model of every car that passed them. The result was staggering. The man didn't miss a single one. At that point, the police treated his testimony as a golden thread and launched the largest vehicle tracking operation in Australian history. Imagine the sheer magnitude of the effort. This was 1960. There were no computers or digital databases. The investigators assigned 25 officers to a near impossible task: go to the main headquarters of the Department of Motor Transport in Sydney and search through the paperwork. The officers locked themselves away for 3 full days, manually flipping through registration cards and hand-printed ownership records. They examined over 270,000 registration cards, one by one. In the end, they managed to narrow it down to just 5,000 cars matching the description: blue 1955 Ford Custom Line. Then began the journey of tracking down and interviewing the owners of these cars, at a time when communication wasn't as easy as it is today, but the police's determination was unshakable. While the paperwork officers were buried in files, the field teams were exerting an equally grueling effort, despite the lack of DNA technology and modern tools. On the second day of the kidnapping, a very significant discovery was made. About 20 kilometers away from the Bondi area where Graham lived, in a remote and abandoned spot amidst thick shrubs and tall grass, police dogs managed to find Graham's school bag. This was the first piece of tangible physical evidence, confirming to investigators that the kidnapper wasn't hiding in the neighborhood, but had taken the child a long distance from his home. Fears began to mount regarding the boy's fate in those isolated regions. The search was no longer limited to the police. Hundreds of soldiers and naval forces were mobilized, supported by helicopters that patrolled the skies of Sydney. Even the general public, children and adults alike, took to the streets in a massive public appeal for help. They combed through forests and remote areas inch by inch across the most difficult terrain. Yet, despite this massive mobilization, the search operations yielded no results. Even Graham's belongings found in the bag were examined by forensic analysts with microscopic precision. But in 1960, without DNA technology, those items remained silent, revealing no secrets about the kidnapper's identity.
Within just a few weeks, Graham's file became the largest case in Australian history. However, the fame of the case and the massive reward money attracted a low-life type of person, scammers trying to exploit the family's pain. Fake reports poured into the police from every direction, from people claiming to have seen the child at the cinema or in shops, to psychics and sorcerers who claimed to know his location. Despite how bizarre some of these reports were, the police didn't dare ignore a single one. The audacity reached a point where some contacted the family home directly. In one instance, the father, Basil, answered a woman claiming to be the kidnapper's accomplice and that Graham was with her. To deceive him, she brought a child to speak on the phone. Basil's heart nearly stopped, but with the intelligence and instinct of a father, he began to ask questions only his real son would know. "What is the name of your best friend at school?" The child went silent and said, "I'm not allowed to answer." "What is the name of the lady who drives you to school?" The child was completely silent. At that moment, Basil knew it was a trick, but he couldn't risk ignoring it. What if this was the only lead? Basil agreed to play along and went to the agreed-upon meeting spot in Western Sydney with the ransom bag, followed by 2 undercover officers. There, a small child approached him, asking for the bag on behalf of a woman. Basil and the police followed the child to the spot he pointed out, but it was completely empty. The woman had vanished like smoke. When they questioned the boy, it turned out she was just a stranger who had given him a small sum of money to carry out the task. The scammer had fled the moment she sensed danger.
That scammer wasn't the only one. The Thorne family home became a target for the scum of the earth. Anonymous letters began arriving for Frida and non-stop calls for Basil. Frida confronted these scammers with sharp wit. She would respond to the letters with impossible questions that only Graham could answer. "What is our dog's name?" Or, "What are your best friends' names?" Silence was always the only reply, confirming to the parents every time that they were facing human monsters, trying to sell them a false dream for money. Every call gave them a pulse of hope, only to kill it in cold blood. Meanwhile, the original kidnapper, the one with the European accent, had vanished completely, as if he never existed, leaving everyone puzzled. Why did he do all this if he didn't intend to finish the trade? 7 heavy weeks passed, and on August 16th in the Seaforth neighborhood of North Sydney, a group of children were playing their daily games in a vacant lot filled with shrubs and large rocks. That lot was their little world, but it hid a secret that would shake the very foundations of the nation. As the children were climbing the rocks, one of them noticed something strange tucked under the ledge of a massive boulder, a blanket wrapped carefully around a small object and hidden with precision. The children approached with curiosity and touched the fabric. They felt something heavy. Their small hearts tightened with fear, and they ran back home to tell their parents. A group of fathers gathered and headed to the rock, with doubt gnawing at their hearts. Quietly and cautiously, with trembling hands, they began to pull back the edge of the blanket without moving it from its place, and there everything went still. From beneath the cloth emerged small human legs, still wearing childhood shoes, the very same shoes Graham had put on that ill-fated morning 7 weeks ago. They called the police and reported what they had found. When the police fully uncovered the blanket, an absolute silence fell. It was the body of little Graham Thorne. Everyone asked in bewilderment, why? What was the point of killing a child after kidnapping him? The place where he was found wasn't far away. It was a neighborhood surrounded by houses in North Sydney, as if the killer wanted the body to be discovered sooner or later. While shock paralyzed Australia, investigators photographed every angle before transporting the body to the forensic pathologist, who revealed the harsh truth. Graham had died of asphyxiation after suffering a skull fracture from repeated, brutal blows to his head. Before the investigators could reach the Thorne home with words of condolence, the television had beaten them to it. The mother, Freda, saw the news on the screen and collapsed. This crime didn't just shatter Basil's family, it shattered the spirit of the entire Australian people. Everyone had expected a ransom and a safe return, but the end was a small pair of shoes and a body hidden beneath a rock. However, this grief quickly turned into fuel for the investigators. They swore they would not sleep until they brought this criminal to justice. Because they lacked DNA analysis, the scientific department mobilized all its resources. Using fine tweezers, they began combing the blanket hair by hair. They found a single brown hair and sent it to Dr. Cameron Cramp. Under the microscope, the doctor confirmed with certainty, this is not a human hair. It belongs to a brown Pekingese dog. Despite the skepticism of some regarding the accuracy of the result, science was preparing another surprise.
Joyce Vickery joined the investigation. She examined the samples stuck to the blanket and discovered a stunning secret. The blanket didn't just contain wild weeds from the vacant lot, it also carried remains of two rare types of ornamental cypress plants. Joyce stated confidently, these plants do not grow in the wild. They came from a domestic garden. Even more strangely, these two specific types are rarely planted together in the same garden. If we find the garden that combines these two plants, we will have found the killer's home. Dr. Joyce didn't stop there. She also examined the fungus found on Graham's shoes. Through precise analysis, she confirmed that the age of this fungus was exactly 7 weeks. In that moment, investigators realized the bitter truth. The kidnapper never intended to negotiate. He had killed Graham in cold blood on the very day of the kidnapping or the day after, spending all those weeks toying with the parents' emotions and demanding ransom for a child who was already dead. While investigators were drowning in the question, why kill him so quickly, science provided one final thread. Experts found strange soil particles clinging to the blanket and Graham's clothes, soil with a pinkish hue. Investigators referred it to geologists, and the result was incredible. This isn't natural soil, it is pink mortar used for binding bricks. Now, the image of the killer's house was complete in the minds of the police. A house with a garden containing two rare types of cypress, walls built with pink mortar, and an owner who possesses a brown dog and a blue 1955 Ford Custom Line. The police published these precise descriptions across every newspaper and radio station, asking the public to be the eyes of the law. It wasn't long before reports began to converge on a single point, the neighborhood of Clontarf in Sydney. Neighbors there called in a state of shock. We have a neighbor who fits all these specifications literally, but they added a piece of information that made the hair on the detectives' necks stand up. This man and his family vanished completely on the very same day the child was kidnapped. The investigators began digging into the life of this mysterious neighbor, whose name was Stephen Bradley. They discovered he was an immigrant from Hungary who had arrived in Australia 10 years prior. The detectives immediately recalled the Eastern European accent they had heard over the phone. Every single thread now led to Bradley. Neighbors recounted the details of that ill-fated morning. His wife, Magda, had left with their 3 children in a taxi, while he stayed inside the house and didn't even come out to say goodbye. With lightning speed, the police discovered that Bradley had hurriedly put his house up for sale weeks earlier. Investigators rushed to Bradley's abandoned house, carrying samples of the rare cypress plants and photos of the trees. The new owner had not yet moved in, so he opened the doors for them. The moment they stepped into the garden was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The rare plants were there, and the pink mortar filled the gaps between the bricks and the walls. They were standing in the crime scene that had witnessed Graham's final breaths. But Bradley was gone. He had already begun his long escape across the seas. As soon as the investigators entered the home, it was as if the house itself was speaking to tell them everything. In the garden, the 2 rare cypress plants stood as witnesses to the kidnapper's presence. In the garage, the wall bricks were bonded together with that strange pink mixture, which perfectly matched the particles found on Graham's clothing. But the real shock was right beneath their feet. On the garage floor, an officer spotted something
small and glistening. It was a tiny thread from the fabric of the same blanket the body had been wrapped in. It was no longer just a suspicion. Graham had been in this garage. And as for the blue Ford, investigators confirmed that Stephen Bradley had indeed owned it, but he had gotten rid of it and sold it shortly before to cover his tracks. The strangeness didn't stop there. They discovered that Bradley and his family had abandoned this house and moved to an apartment in the Manly area on July 7, 1960. Yes, on the very same day and hour that Graham was kidnapped. The question that puzzled investigators was, had he planned this departure in advance, or did he commit his crime and flee in the same instant?
A large force set out for his new apartment in Manly, but they found it empty, with only the wind dwelling inside. Bradley and his family had vanished once again. They searched the apartment inch by inch, then moved out to comb the surrounding area. While officers were searching through the piles of trash discarded outside the building, they found something small that might easily have gone unnoticed: an old, undeveloped roll of camera film. Little did the investigators know then that this neglected film amidst the waste would carry the images that would reveal the killer's face and end this manhunt forever.
In those days, photos weren't digital. Film was the sole repository of memories. The roll of film the police found in the trash was distorted and mangled, as if its owner had tried to destroy the truth with his own hands before discarding it. However, forensic lab experts fought a battle to clean and process it, and when the images finally appeared, the shock was total. Stephen Bradley appeared on a family trip with his wife and children, and they were clearly sitting on the very same blanket that had been used to wrap Graham's body. The same patterns, the same colors. Without knowing it, the killer had documented his crime in his own family photo album. Remember the brown dog hair that some mocked the doctor for identifying? Science triumphed once again. Investigators confirmed through neighbors that the Bradley family did indeed own a Pekingese dog. With great cunning, they tracked the dog's trail and found that Bradley had left it at a veterinary clinic with instructions to ship it out of the country later. The police seized the dog immediately, took hair samples, and compared them to what was found on the body. It was a perfect match. That single hair, only millimeters long, had now become a hangman's noose around Stephen's neck. The flood of evidence did not stop there. Investigators successfully tracked down the new owner of the blue Ford. They opened the trunk and, using their precision tools, examined every corner. There, amidst the dust, they discovered fiber remnants from Graham's clothing and strands of hair from his small head. The car, which had been the vehicle for the kidnapping, had now become a mobile crime scene that confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt Stephen Bradley was the kidnapper and the killer. Now, the police had the criminal, the motive, and the damning evidence, but they were met with a bitter truth that made their blood run cold. Stephen Bradley and his family were no longer in Australia. The killer had managed to cross the border, and now the largest international manhunt in the history of the Australian continent began. Bradley had fled, but he did not know that the ghosts of his evidence would haunt him to the far reaches of the ocean. Stephen Bradley realized the noose was tightened, so he decided to flee with his family aboard the SS Himalaya bound for London, leaving his brown dog at a veterinary clinic to be shipped later. But he did not know that Graham's cry had reached the police before the ship had even left Australian waters. The police immediately contacted the ship's captain, ordering him to watch Bradley with absolute secrecy, like a shadow. When the ship docked in Colombo, Sri Lanka, the authorities were there waiting for him. These images you see are real footage of the moment of his arrest on the pier, ending his long dream of escape.
Bradley did not surrender easily. He maintained his innocence and fought his extradition to Australia, exploiting the lack of a formal extradition treaty between the two countries at the time. A bitter legal battle ensued for weeks, while his wife, Magda, continued her journey to London with their 3 children.
However, on October 18, 1960, justice prevailed. The Sri Lankan judiciary ruled to extradite Bradley to face Australian justice. The brilliant detectives Harry Bateman and Doyle were sent to collect him. During the long return flight on a standard passenger plane, Detective Harry began his psychological game. Harry was renowned for his extraordinary ability to soften even the most hardened criminals. He didn't confront Bradley with violence. Instead, he drew close to him, kindled his guilt, and made him feel that a confession was his only way to lift the heavy burden from his soul. There, amidst the clouds, Bradley broke down and confessed to everything. But this confession would remain a secret that we will uncover shortly. The plane landed in Sydney amidst a media frenzy unlike anything the country had ever seen. While journalists watched the main cabin door, the police spirited Bradley away through a rear exit to avoid the wrath of the crowds. The trial began on March 21, 1961, and it brought a major surprise. Stephen Bradley retracted everything and pleaded not guilty, claiming his mid-air confession had been made under duress. But the prosecution had something stronger than words. They had a mountain of evidence: 70 witnesses, the blue Ford, the pink mortar, the dog hair, and the rare plants.
The defense tried to portray the events as an unfortunate accident, but the forensic pathologist's report was as sharp as a sword. Graham did not die by chance. He had been subjected to repeated, brutal blows to the head with clear signs of strangulation. He had been drugged and killed in cold blood. Throughout the trial, Stephen Bradley wore a mask of innocence and refused to officially confess. However, the truth was hidden in the details of the secret conversation between him and Detective Harry during the flight. Bradley was not just a desperate man in need of money. He was a monster forged by war and refined by fraud. The story began in Hungary. It was there that Bradley lived through the horrors of World War II and learned how to survive at the expense of others. He immigrated to Italy and eventually ended up in Australia in 1950, claiming to be a doctor. But the truth was, he held no qualifications whatsoever. He was forced to work in construction and sales, but his eye was always on quick wealth. He married a Hungarian immigrant named Eva, who came from a wealthy family. In 1955, a mysterious incident occurred. The brakes on Eva's car suddenly failed, causing her immediate death. Bradley inherited all her property and money. Although the police found no evidence against him at the time, her father continued to scream until his dying day, "Stephen killed my daughter to take her money."
Bradley didn't wait long. Less than a year after his wife's death, he began a secret affair with a married woman named Magda. This relationship led to her divorce, after which he married her and adopted her 2 children from her previous husband. The chain of fraud continued. He forged his qualifications to work as a psychotherapist, then worked as a nurse in a mental asylum before his deception was uncovered and he was fired 5 months later. He was a man who lived on fabrication. When he read the news in the papers about Basil Thorne winning the $5 million lottery, he didn't see a success story, he saw an easy prey. Bradley admitted to the detective that he had been watching the Thorne home for weeks. He would sit in that park, hiding behind his newspaper, studying little Graham's schedule and the details of their lives. He even went so far as to knock on their door himself, under the pretext of asking for a fictitious person just to see his victims' faces from the inside. He had planned everything with precision, from the blue car to the blanket, right down to the idea of fleeing the country on the very day of the crime. There was no room for coincidence in Stephen Bradley's dictionary. Stephen Bradley's crime was not a product of chance. It was a blend of accumulated failures and class resentment. This man, who had mastered fraud, from forging medical certificates to burning down his own restaurant for the insurance, could not bear to see the news of Basil Thorne winning the lottery. He asked himself with malice, "By what right does this fool win millions while I struggle?" From there, the plan began. He studied international kidnapping cases, surveilled the Thorne home, and selected his victim. He had initially planned to kidnap the young daughter, Belinda, but found that snatching Graham on his way to school was far easier.
On that morning, Bradley parked his blue car at the intersection. When Graham approached, Bradley called him by name, mentioning his mother and his school, and told him a calculated lie. "Your Aunt Phyllis is sick, and I'm here to pick you up instead." The innocent child got into the car, unaware that he was stepping into a mobile coffin. In cold blood, Bradley drugged the boy with a chemical substance, bound his hands and feet, and threw him into the trunk. He called the family to demand the ransom, then returned to his house, which he was clearing of furniture that very same day, to cover his tracks. While the movers were busy in the house, Graham began to regain consciousness inside the trunk in the garage. Fearing exposure, Bradley tried to drug him again, but he had run out of the chemical. When the child began to resist and scream, the criminal lost his mind. He grabbed a piece of iron and struck the boy's head several times until his voice fell silent forever. Instead of money, Bradley now had a corpse. He disposed of the matter quickly. He wrapped the boy in the blanket and discarded him beneath the rocks in Seaforth, believing it was a deserted area no one would visit, oblivious to the fact that vacant lots are a child's favorite playground. The trial lasted only 9 days. Despite his denial, the mountain of scientific evidence crushed him completely. The judge pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment. The courtroom and the crowds outside erupted in cheers. The scoundrel of Sydney had finally received his punishment. Bradley did not last long behind bars. In 1968, he died of a heart attack at the age of 43, passing away unmourned. The story of Graham Thorne came to an end, but his memory changed the history of Australia forever. Because of this tragedy, a new law was enacted granting major prize winners the right to anonymity, protecting their privacy from the eyes of the greedy. Graham is gone, but he left behind a law that protects thousands of families from tasting the bitterness experienced by his father, Basil, and his mother, Frida. In the end, money may bring luck, but sometimes it awakens the demons from their lairs.